I would like to thank you all for joining us today in the third webinar in the SOSI Lunch and Learn webinar series. The topics my colleagues will be discussing with you today is data collection. I, however, would like to take a minute to introduce the SOSI Center, the webinar series, and the goal of today's webinar. SOSI Center is a collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri, University of Michigan, and Understanding Interventions Organization. This is the SOSI Center leadership team. I would like to point out that SOSI Center is funded by the National Science Foundation, and Dr. Natasha Davis is the PI of our grant. An overview of the SOSI Center. SOSI Center is dedicated to cultivating the cultural awareness and scholarly productivity of future and existing program leaders by providing venues for training and development related to implementation of research guided by critical, identity-focused, and social cognitive theoretical frames. Methodologies relevant to developing critical scholarly contributions to inform practice, scholarship development, and dissemination. The goals of SOSI: challenging and changing deficit-based approaches to supporting underrepresented students in STEM by teaching critical strength-based frameworks. Demonstrating the capacity of critical strength-based frameworks to create and evaluate STEM learning spaces that foster student success in ways that embrace and build upon students' social identities and cultural experiences. Offering a repository of resources specific to designing, implementing, researching, and evaluating STEM programming. Increasing STEM programming research production and dissemination by teaching strategies for publishing and presenting opportunities to publish. The purpose of the SOSI Lunch and Learn webinar series is to offer members of the STEM broadening participation community information on how to operationalize critical strength-based frameworks within dissemination efforts that speak to a variety of audiences regarding the outcomes and impact of STEM broadening participation programs. The goal of the webinar series is to support participants with cultivating the materials necessary to advance individual writing and dissemination efforts that can take place during the SOSI Summer Institute of 2023. I would like to point out that we have two other webinars in the webinar series: What is Data? And Integrating Theory and Data, which can be found on the links provided. The webinar goals frame why data collection is important and challenges with dissemination. Review types of data collection processes and their connection to STEM broadening participation. Highlight prominent constructs typically explored within broadening participation programs. Share sample scales and protocols associated with these constructs. Provide relevant examples of data collection and dissemination, and discuss how to take a critical strength-based approach. Now, I would like to turn the webinar over to my colleague, Dr. Natalie Downer.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we as program administrators face with respect to data collection in broadening participation. When I was thinking about how I was going to put this piece together, I really thought about my own challenges and how they will likely be applicable to the folks that are on this webinar. And so they are as follows. How to collect data, or what kind of data does one collect for the purpose of dissemination in this space? How does one go about creating a culture of scholarship? How do we become practitioners as well as creators of evidence-based practices? How do we design and implement assessments to evaluate efficacy? Though traditional data sets such as retention, enrollment, and persistence are important, how do we move beyond those traditional data sets? How does one measure belonging, engaging environments, and developing awareness of identity, to name a few? How does one foster and factor these concepts into one's research project and space? Other challenges faced. How does one tap into a community and network of scholars, such as understanding interventions, which we'll learn about today, as well as SOSI? In crafting your story, our story, where can we find credible papers where this type of work is being done? How do we gain exposure to educational and social science concepts and ideas? Some examples: Understanding Interventions, American Biology Teacher, Journal of College Science and Teaching, as well as CBE, Life Science Education. How do we reframe programming and activities from the lens of a deficit to a strength-based approach? The historical perspective is that if our participants are from underserved backgrounds, then we need to fix them rather than see the value that they bring to the space. How do we continue to develop our sense of cultural competency? How do we gain exposure to theoretical and concept frameworks, such as the ones that are discussed and analyzed here at SOSI? Community cultural wealth, social cognitive career theory, as well as PVEST. How can these theories and frameworks develop or enhance programming? How do we implement them? I remember when I was first introduced to these theories and frameworks, I thought, I love this. I'm inspired. But wait, how do I do this? For research and publication purposes, how does one connect outcomes and outputs to these theories? For more information, I'll pass things on to Dr. Natasha Davis.
Thank you, Natalie. So I'll be walking us through types of data collection and its connection to broadening participation outcomes. So the first thing you want to do is ask yourself, what do you really want to know? And so this is really important in thinking about particularly broadening participation programs. What is the information that you want to know, that you want to be able to make sure that you're having to tell the story about your program, which we'll talk about kind of at the end of this segment here. So when considering what data to collect, particularly in this aspect, it's essential for you to identify the objectives in the target audience. So collecting demographic data is really important, and it provides really valuable insights into the project. However, these traditional means of data collection, these quantitative means, are really important. So you're looking at things such as completion rates and retention and matriculation, but they may not fully capture the nuances associated with the outcomes of your program. So with that, the evaluation process needs to go beyond kind of the surface level of metrics and really consider more aspects, including learning outcomes and changes in participation's attitudes, self-efficacy, or sense of belonging. Additionally, considering key stakeholders and thinking about what it is that they want to know is important to consider as well. So now that we've thought about the type of data that we want to collect, let's talk about methods that we want to use to be able to kind of gather and analyze that data. So let's think about quantitative versus qualitative methods. So quantitative and qualitative techniques are very distinct in their methods of gathering and analyzing data. Qualitative techniques usually involve obtaining empirical data, and this is usually done through data collecting tools and methods like open-ended interviews, observations, focus groups, or document analysis. On the other hand, quantitative research focuses on things like numerical data, and these are usually collected through tools such as surveys, assessments, inventories, or ratings. So while quantitative data will give us that empirical results that we can use to statistically analyze for patterns of generalizability, maybe across populations, qualitative techniques offer typically a deeper understanding of really what's happening in your program or particular phenomenons within a specific context. So those are things to consider in thinking about what's going to actually work best in the story that you want to tell around your program. So if you see value, though, in utilizing both quantitative and qualitative approaches, you can use what's referred to as a mixed method approach. And so a mixed method approach is the process that combines both the quantitative and qualitative in terms of gathering that data. And so this approach recognizes the need for a more comprehensive understanding of the program in itself and employing different sources to be able to collect that data. So by using both qualitative and quantitative methods, it addresses the comparative weaknesses of relying on just one of the single approaches. The strength of this approach lies definitely in its ability to provide a more holistic view by incorporating various viewpoints and multiple types of data. However, it's important to acknowledge that this methodology also has its weaknesses as well. And so while we're looking at it as being able to kind of strengthen things, a mixed method approach does have the advantage of combining those, but it also is challenging in integrating these two different types of methods effectively. So the process of collecting and analyzing data from multiple sources requires definitely careful consideration in ensuring that the findings converge and that you're able to provide a comprehensive understanding of your project. So as we touched on briefly, data collection tools, styles, and techniques are essential for gathering information and insights. So we want to think about the different tools that we can utilize. And one of the ones that really come to mind, I think, for a lot of people, particularly when you're thinking about gathering information for participants, is survey data. And this could be done in both a qualitative and qualitative manner in terms of that data collection, as it really does help to document perceptions, attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs within a clear, predetermined sample. And so with that, when you have the opportunity to kind of design questions that cover a wide spectrum of subject matters, these surveys really can provide coherent responses. Interviews offer a more personalized approach, and they really do enable those that are interviewing to engage with participants and really gain a deeper understanding of their point of views, as they often do capture participants' accounts and perceptions to various phenomena. Additionally, they often add rich text and context for us to be able to kind of think about the generalization of themes and theories and models that could be developed from these particular interviews. Focus groups are similar to interviews in that they allow for that really rich understanding and engagement. But they also are done in a group setting, and that often captures the differences and similarities of and perspectives shared by other participants. So in addition to data collection and surveys and focus groups, there's also other methods that we can utilize to kind of gather some valuable insights. And that includes things like observations and investigations. And so observations are interesting as they allow us to kind of think about ways that we can link what people do with why they do them. Okay, and then finally we have the content analysis. And so content analysis looks at being able to kind of gain a perspective from the different types of documentations that are available, artifacts often which include newspapers, research articles, and governmental reports, things like that, for us to be able to kind of understand the experiences and perspectives of the groups as well. So now that we've had the opportunity to talk about what type of data we want to collect, the different methods and being able to collect that data and the different tools that we want to use, let's think about timing. Okay, and so when we think about that, we think about it in kind of two forms, informative evaluation and summative evaluation. So let's look at formative evaluation first. So formative evaluation is a type that involves the analysis of acquired information, and this allows us to make necessary corrections and changes and adjustments in the program throughout its life. So this type assists in gathering data and making those appropriate changes to ensure program improvement. So by conducting formative evaluations, programs, project organizers can really identify areas of improvement and make those necessary changes to enhance the effectiveness of the project. So formative evaluations really does have kind of two components to it. The first is implementation evaluation, and the second is progress evaluation. So the purpose of the implementation evaluation is to assess whether the project is being conducted as planned and to help the project ensure whether its components are operating as intended. So this type of evaluation may occur once or may occur several times during the life of the program. Progress evaluation is just that. It really does focus on measuring the progress towards the goals and objectives and meeting those. So it involves collecting information to learn whether or not progress was made and it also is there to also point out any unexpected developments that may be happening. So additionally, the information collected through a progress evaluation helps to determine what the impact of the activities and the strategies are on participants, its curriculum, its environment or institution that it is at various stages of the intervention. So data collected as part of this type of evaluation really do form the basis for our summative evaluation. So now let's look at summative evaluation. So it too can be viewed in two components, both outcome evaluation and impact evaluation. Outcome evaluation measures to what extent the program or intervention is achieving its objectives and outcomes in the target population. So the evaluation is performed following the time frame speculated for the change and the impact and making sure all this has occurred. In addition, it allows for the evaluator or researcher to collect information about the outcomes as it relates to processes, strategies, and activities that have been led to these outcomes. It also uncovers changes in program participants that result directly from the program, such as gains in new knowledge and awareness, attitude changes, beliefs, social norms, behavioral changes, etc. Impact evaluation measures more of a community level of change or longer-term results that have occurred as a result of the program or the intervention. These impacts are typically bigger and broader effects and typically are shown as to whether or not they had effect on an entire institution, community, organization, society, or the environment. So following the collection of your data, you can then begin to think about how to use the information to tell the full story of your program. So you want to think about how you're going to develop a reporting plan, and you want to ask yourself, how will the data be analyzed, and how will the results be summarized, interpreted, and disseminated, and how will they also be used to improve program implementation in the future? Additionally, another thing to think about is sharing those lessons learned. And this is going to really help to inform decision making and the distribution of findings to maximize use and have a broader reach and then result in maybe broader impacts as it relates to your program. So now I'd like to turn it over to Shantae Outlaw.
Thanks, Natasha. Hello, I am Shantae Outlaw, Resource Specialist with the SOSI Center. Let's delve into some prominent constructs explored in broadening participation work. Psychosocial factors are characteristics that influence an individual psychologically and/or socially. These behaviors, skills, attitudes, and strategies outside of the cognitive realm of intelligence are used to navigate environments and have been shown to affect motivation, performance, sustained investment, engagement, and retention in STEM. Such factors help to describe an individual in relation to their social and academic environments and how these affect the holistic individual, including physical and mental health, academic outcomes, career selection, and well-being. Frameworks such as social cognitive career theory, also known as SCCT, and others that we have discussed in our previous webinars illustrate how psychosocial factors can mold career interests. Development of these factors through interventions like those employed in your programs has been shown to reduce racial, ethnic, and gender disparities in STEM performance and degree attainment, and positively impact STEM career outcomes. You can explore these factors through your program evaluations to further describe your participants in relation to your program's environment and add context to your data. Additionally, your data can be further developed into broadly disseminated research to add to the body of literature in STEM broadening participation. I have information on standardized test scores. I have information on grades. I have information on GPA. I have information on retention within specific courses. I have information on retention within the major. I have information on graduation rates. What else could I possibly be missing? Let's talk about some examples of psychosocial factors and their effects on broadening participation. Let's start with science identity. Science identity can just be summed up in terms of how an individual seeks to be a scientist. Now, this is constructed through the iterative interactions with scientific, social, and material contexts. Now, an individual with a strong sense of identity would exhibit some sense of community and affiliation that's built by these consistent extrinsic and intrinsic attitudinal factors. This sense of identity can be built by participating in relevant activities like those that are in your programs, and followed by categorizing oneself as a member in the scientific community. Now, yes, there are many factors that can influence how a perceived identity is formed, but this can include stereotypes that are rooted in historical inequities like race and gender. But a person who has a strong science identity is more likely to pursue a career in science. And you guessed it, the lack of a science identity can have the opposite effect. Now, in terms of the expectancy value for STEM careers, it's broken down into expectations for success and subjective task value. Expectations for success are a person's beliefs about how well they expect to perform on a given task. And there are many factors that influence expectations for success. Self-efficacy, which we will define shortly, is one of the most important factors because it's been linked to expectancies, performance, and persistence in achievement-related tasks. Those include decisions to choose and persist in STEM majors. Now, subjective task value can be defined as the quality of a task that contributes to the increasing or decreasing probability that an individual will actually select it. And it further defines the quality of that task in terms of these four components: attainment value, intrinsic or interest value, utility value, and cost value. Now, the attainment value, of course, is the personal importance that individuals attach to doing well on a particular task. Like, how well does this task actually fit within my individual self-identity? Okay? Intrinsic or interest value has to do with the inherent immediate enjoyment that an individual gains from engaging in a given task, or the anticipated enjoyment that the individual expects to get while engaging in that task. Utility value, of course, refers to the usefulness of the task, or how this task fits into the future goals or plans of an individual, like their career goals. And then the relative cost refers to what an individual would have to give up in order to engage in a given task, and it may include the effort that's required to succeed, the time that's lost for other valued tasks, and or the psychological cost of failure or emotional trauma that could result from failure. So students have to choose between various tasks, such as, for going out with friends or going to a movie in order to do this assignment. So the relative cost is the movie or the hanging out that the student didn't attend. Other examples of psychosocial factors that have an effect on broadening participation are mentoring, sense of belonging, well-being, and self-efficacy. STEM mentoring can be referred to as a relationship that provides a support system that promotes identity and social integration into scholarship and the academic community. STEM mentorship has been shown to be a vital component of programming for students, especially those traditionally underrepresented in STEM fields. Studies show that individuals who observe and interact with career role models who have a similar background have a greater persistence in their STEM career. A lack of representation, on the other hand, can serve as a barrier to retention and persistence in STEM. A sense of belonging is defined as being accepted, valued, included, and encouraged by others, especially those of authority and peers within a particular environment, be it academic, research, or social, and of feeling oneself to be an important part of the life and activity of that particular environment. An individual's sense of belonging has been identified as a potential lever to promote success, engagement, and well-being in STEM. Research shows that sense of belonging is related to how an individual thinks, how they feel, and the resulting behaviors that come from those thoughts and feelings, like showing up to class, participating in research, and persisting in STEM careers. A basic human need and motivation, however, is sense of belonging. And sense of belonging, of course, is dynamic. It fluctuates from activity to activity. And as we've mentioned prior, environment is a key factor. That environment includes the individuals that are within that environment, including your instructors, the mentors, the administrators, the peers, etc. Well-being, in its most common model, is defined through subjective aspects and psychological aspects. Those subjective aspects include the presence of high positive emotion, low negative emotions, and satisfaction with life. Psychological aspects include environmental mastery, self-acceptance, meaning and purpose in life, positive relationships, autonomy, and personal growth. It's been found that a higher well-being reduces a risk for the development of mental illness, is predictive of recovery from physical and mental illness, reduces health risky behaviors, and increases life expectancy. And in terms of STEM persistence, from a holistic perspective, all of those are very relevant. In the wake of the most recent COVID-19 pandemic, well-being has become a major focus for concern, research, and action. And one of the most important social determinants of well-being is a sense of community connectiveness and belonging. Higher well-being has since been linked to greater persistence in STEM. Self-efficacy can be defined as a person's judgment of their capabilities to organize and execute courses of action that are required to attain designated type of performances. Self-efficacy describes the confidence that an individual may have gathered internally to motivate them to think that they can successfully execute the necessary actions that are needed to accomplish all the tasks required to achieve a particular goal. Self-efficacy usually answers the question, can I do this? It is known that people with high self-efficacy may set high goals for themselves. They may develop strong strategies to implement these goals, and they may be willing to not just persist, but persist longer in the face of challenges and occasional setbacks. Research has linked self-efficacy beliefs of students to their level of interest and persistence in STEM majors. Research has also shown that, compared to men, women have lower self-efficacy beliefs in STEM majors, specifically those of mathematics, chemistry, engineering, and computer science. Studies also show that women who switch STEM majors have a lower STEM self-efficacy than women who persist in STEM majors, even though they may have equal or better levels of academic achievement. Being able to measure these constructs and attitudes is of critical importance to advancing research in how to retain a more diverse pool of STEM majors. Therefore, increasing the number of STEM graduates from minoritized populations, and in turn, diversifying the STEM workforce. Within the past decade, researchers have developed valid and reliable instruments to measure students' attitudes towards STEM programs and careers. Additionally, here are some common instruments that are used to measure psychosocial factors, including self-efficacy, science identity, expectancy, and sense of belonging. If you are interested in learning where to find other instruments, utilize the UI index. Head to index.understandinginterventions.org, type in a keyword, and perform a search. We know that searching for relevant literature and instruments to support your program design, implementation, evaluation, quality enhancement, and even research can be a daunting task. We here at the SOSI Center, including the Universities of Missouri and Michigan and the nonprofit Understanding Interventions, encourage you to use the UI Index. The UI Index is a one-stop shop, searchable interface for finding literature specifically on broadening participation in science. We invite you to use this resource as your guide for deepening your understanding of the work that's happening locally, nationally, and globally to broaden STEM participation. Thank you for your time. I now hand things over to my colleague Angela Ebrio for a discussion of examples of scales and protocols.
Thank you, Shantae. So Shantae has just introduced you to some of the most frequently assessed concepts in the broadening participation literature. Now that you have some idea about approaches to collecting data and having been introduced to some of these concepts, I'd like to talk to you in a little bit more detail about the process of collecting and using data. And I'm going to do this by providing an example from the current literature. So the article from which my example is taken is an article that is about research mentoring and science identity, insights from undergraduates and their mentors. The International Journal of STEM Education is an open source journal, so I believe this should be you should be able to access this. And I have DOI here in case you would like to obtain this article. So the authors of the article had this particular question in mind. Do mentoring experiences in science apprenticeships predict the extent to which undergraduates psychologically identify with science? So this is an issue of science identity and whether or not the different mentoring strategies used by mentors affects the attitudes and behaviors and beliefs of the undergraduates whom they mentor. And in particular, does it have an effect on their identity as scientists? So the authors developed this study because they wanted to extend the existing knowledge on mentoring in two different ways. So first they wanted to collect data from student mentored dyads instead of just from mentees. A lot of the literature at the time this article was published only collected data from students. And the second way in which they wanted to extend current knowledge was to consider both negative aspects of mentoring along with positive aspects. So here are some steps that can be used to collect quantitative data. So in the first step, you as a staff member or developer of an intervention or program would identify concepts that you are interested in and decide how to measure these concepts. Of course, you might be working with an evaluator or a researcher to identify these concepts, but you should at least be able to understand what your consultant is actually measuring and what concepts those measures are designed to assess. And then the second step, you would assess the validity and reliability of the measures that are being used, and also investigate the appropriateness of using these specific measures in your population, your target populations. And step 3, you would develop a plan to collect your data and also to analyze it. And step 4, you would use the measures to actually collect data from your group or groups. And then in step 5, you would manage and analyze data. In other words, you would be using the data to answer your evaluation or your research question. So let's go over steps in more detail. In step 1, you would identify the concept. In this particular example, the authors of the study were interested in science identity. In particular, science identity in this study was being used as an outcome. And mentoring are the variables that are used by the authors to understand what leads to different levels of science identity. So again, the definition of science identity is that it's the degree to which students perceive their science-related pursuits as being integral to their sense of self. And then step 1B would be to actually decide how to measure the concept. And again, in this case, the concept is science identity. So there's two strategies that I want to mention in terms of identifying and deciding upon a measure. So one is to identify an existing measure, meaning one that already exists in the literature, and you would do this by looking for articles that use measures that were developed by other people. You would probably want to look for articles that actually publish the items that are used on the measure and also the response scale that the authors used. In the second strategy, if you did not find an existing measure or for some reason did not want to use an existing measure, you could always develop a measure if none are identified. All right. The authors in this particular article used the science identity scale, which was developed by Martin Chenders and his colleagues in 2011. And this scale consists of 6 items. They are on the screen for you, and as you can see, they're all student is asked whether or not they agree with or with each of these items. So in step 2, after you've either developed the measure or found one in the existing literature, is that you would want to assess the validity, the reliability, and the appropriate use of this measure. These 3 aspects of using a measure are technical, and I'm not going to talk about them in detail here, but you would probably, if you were going to develop a measure, you probably would want to work with a collaborator who has expertise in developing measures, or a consultant with the same level of experience and expertise. So I'll mention or define for you what each of these issues, I guess, in using and deciding a measure are. So the issue of validity has to do with whether or not the measure assesses the concept of interest, in this case, science identity, as intended. The issue of reliability has to do with whether or not the measure assesses the concept, again, the concept here is science identity, consistently across time, across individual persons, and across different types of situations. Another way of thinking about it, about reliability, is whether or not the items on this measure are related or correlated with each other. And this is often, you might see this in the literature as being labeled or talked about as the internal consistency, reliability of a measure. So this measure of tremors, the science identity scale, that reliability has been actually reported in existing literature, and its internal consistency reliability is quite high. It's 0.092. Again, and then the third issue has to do with the appropriateness of use of a measure. So this has to do with do you have evidence, or is there evidence in the literature that your specific groups of interest may respond differently to this scale or to this measure than the groups that the measure was initially developed for. Note that the science of identity scale has previously been used in studies of undergraduates who have traditionally been underrepresented in science fields of study. So based on existing literature, different levels of experience as reported in existing published studies, it was deemed appropriate to use in this specific example because underrepresented students was a population of interest for these authors. So in step 3 is you would develop a data collection an analysis plan. So the authors of the study do not explicitly describe their data collection or analysis plan, but it's reported in the research report to the extent that it's described for other researchers to be able to evaluate what the authors actually did. So data collection plan, it helps you lay out when you would assess or measure various concepts. You would make some decisions about what particular mode to use in collecting data. In this particular study, the authors decided to ask the questions using an online survey, but they of course had other modes that they could have used. They could have developed a phone survey protocol, or they could have developed a paper survey and asked students to complete it in person. There's some decisions that have to be made in terms of who will respond to your items, and usually this depends on the particular data collection purpose. So if you're a program manager or program staff, a program developer, and you're primarily interested only in the persons who are, for whom the program or intervention is implemented, then perhaps you only would want to have students in that particular target group respond to your questions. Sometimes, if you're working with a researcher who is conducting research related to your program or your intervention, you might want to, in addition to including persons who are exposed to the activities in the intervention, you might want to have a comparison group or groups, one of which may consist of people who have not been exposed or not experienced the intervention activities. You might also want, as part of your data collection plan, want to state some inclusion criteria for the respondents. In this particular study, because they were interested in understanding mentoring, the inclusion criteria for the students had to do with whether or not they actually had a mentor, whether the student gave permission to the researchers to contact their mentor, and also for the mentor part of the project, the mentor had to respond to the actual survey that was implemented for the mentors. You might also want to develop a data analysis plan, and usually you would base this plan on the type of analyses that will actually answer your evaluation or research questions. And you would plan, another consideration for a data analysis plan is how you will disseminate findings so that they are easily understood by specific audiences. So you may have a different way of presenting your findings to other persons on your program staff, persons who are from the funding agency or your funder, and of course you might want to disseminate the information to the students who have actually participated in your program. Now, of course, you can develop a plan for both collecting and analyzing data, but things happen and you might have to modify the plan based on either technical or practical concerns. All right. In steps 4 and 5, you would use them. In step 4, you would use the measure to collect data from your groups. And usually, since in both research and in evaluation, you would want to know something about the program's effects on students or whatever target population your program is designed for. You want to collect data both on measures of your program outcomes and on the concepts that you believe are related to these outcomes. So for instance, you can have different sorts of activities, peer mentoring, faculty mentoring, study groups, professional career development activities, etc. in your program. And so you could use participation or amount of participation in those activities as a predictor of your program outcomes. In this particular study that I'm using as an example, the authors were specifically focusing in on the mentoring aspect of this program and how it relates again to the development or different levels of science identity. So the authors were interested in collecting data on 3 different types of mentoring. Instrumental mentoring is mentoring that is designed to actually help students improve some aspect of their academic performance or improve their attitudes towards science, etc. The example item from representing instrumental mentoring that I have here is the statement, "I help students improve their writing skills." Social emotional mentoring has to do with mentors' behaviors and actions that are related to the emotional development or the psychological aspects of the student's work. The example item here is I showed this student that I cared. Though instrumental and social emotional mentoring are both considered positive aspects of mentoring, and as I mentioned earlier, these authors were also interested in the negative aspects of mentoring. The example item here is I sometimes ignore this student. So then, step 5 is to actually use the data that you collect to answer your specific research question. Again, to repeat their question of interest, they were interested in understanding whether or not undergraduate science identity is related to the students' reports of instrumental, social, emotional, and negative aspects of mentoring. So what did they find? They found that the greater perceived instrumental and social emotional mentoring by the students led to higher levels of science identity in those students. They also found that when students perceived greater negative mentoring from their mentors, that resulted in lower levels of science identity. All right, the authors of this particular example, they also collected qualitative data. And as you can see here, the steps in collecting qualitative data are similar to those used for quantitative data. So in collecting qualitative data, you would develop open-ended questions to elicit more nuanced answers. In step 2, you would include open-ended questions in an interview or focus group protocol, or embed them in a survey. In this specific example, the authors embedded open-ended items into a survey sent to the mentors of the students. In step 3, data would be collected from the group. In this case, data were collected from the mentors. In step 4, the researchers made decisions regarding data analysis. And in step 5, they used the data to answer their evaluation question or research question. Okay, so again, this is the same example. The author's purpose was to obtain information on mentors' perspectives on research mentoring. So in the first step, they developed an open-ended question to elicit these more nuanced answers about the behaviors that mentors exhibit or demonstrate towards their mentees. So they asked this question within the survey to mentors that they gave to the mentors. The question was, describe factors that encourage you to engage in research mentoring. In other words, why do you like to mentor? Why do you want to, or why do you actually mentor students? And this was a way to assess the motivation behind mentoring for the particular faculty members. And in step 2, they included this open-ended question in their survey, as I just mentioned. In step 3, they collected data from the mentors, and then they had to make this particular decisions that are related to the analysis of qualitative data. So there's 2 different approaches that they could have taken. One is inductive. That is where the researchers have no a priori expectations regarding the various themes that might emerge from the data. Or they could have taken a deductive approach. This is where they have some expectations or hypotheses about the types of mentoring that would be described by the mentors, and also about how the mentors would talk about how those different strategies of mentoring are related to the students, changing the students' attitudes or behaviors. So in step 5, they used the data to answer their research question. In this particular example, the authors conducted a thematic analysis of all the responses, and this thematic analysis is basically an inductive kind of strategy. The authors and their research assistants read the responses several times and then determined the frequencies with which different motors were actually mentioned by the mentors. And they found that just under 20% of the mentors mentioned that they were interested in, they were motivated to mentor because they were interested in enhancing either gender equity or ethnic equity in science. And then another 15% of the mentors mentioned that they wanted to mentor because they wanted to provide general support for their students. All right, that is the end of my section and the description of the kinds of steps that you might take in collecting both quantitative and qualitative data.
Thank you so much. So now you all have had the opportunity to hear from my colleagues talk about the data collection process, thinking specifically about the challenges that individuals involved in broadening participation programs may face when it comes to thinking about collecting and disseminating data. We've talked about the data collection process more specifically from an evaluation component as we think about the different quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods approaches that could be applied. We discussed significant constructs that are traditionally found in research and evaluation associated with broadening participation programs and the dissemination of their impact and outcome. We gave you insight into one particular scale, a science identity scale, discussing then the potential of what it could look like to use this kind of measure, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and provided a very pragmatic example associated with data coming out of a broadening participation program and how the different data can be presented to tell a story about what's transpiring and the impact that's happening. Now, I get the pleasure to really help us think more deeply and intentionally about that storytelling process as I talk about how we can use a critical, strengths-based approach to interpreting the data collection, analysis, and storytelling process. So when I think about a critical strengths-based approach, I'm very intentional in naming it as a framework that can help ground and bound our data collection process, our data analysis process, and even our interpretation of the data as we think about disseminating the outcomes associated with our programs. And so as a framework that both grounds our ideas and bounds the different ways in which we disseminate the stories from these ideas, a critical strengths-based approach suggests that we situate our perspective by focusing on the strengths that students bring rather than trying to focus on the things that they lack or focusing on the things that our programs provide as a fix to the students. So critical strengths-based programs ask us to think about the assets that students already possess and then leverage within the actual broadening participation space. Critical strengths-based approaches ask us to then think about what is it that our programs are doing to build upon, enhance, or strengthen those assets that students bring into the program. So again, this framework or this approach to the framework is not focusing on how our programs fix students or even account for structural barriers that they may be navigating, but instead what our programs are doing to enhance the strengths, the gifts, the talents, the insights, and the outcomes that students bring and leverage within our programs. These frameworks suggest that we don't look to compare across groups, but rather we focus to understand within groups. Most times when we're comparing across groups, we create these unintentioned senses of normality. We create this desire to say X group is not the same as, or is performing at the same rate as, or is equivalent to Y group. And in making those kinds of comparisons, we inherently or unintentionally create this idea of a standard normalized perspective, which often disenfranchises people from marginalized groups. So this critical strengths-based approach suggests that we focus more on understanding and exploring and explaining what's happening within groups rather than looking to compare across groups. And ultimately, this approach, as we're thinking about it in our data collection, analysis, and storytelling process, is really having us think about why and how we can intervene on environmental structures and outcomes as a means for transformation and change, as opposed to trying to intervene on people. Again, building from the assets that people leverage and already maintain in our programs, focusing our efforts outwards towards thinking about changing structures, places, and spaces to better fit, support, and engage those individuals. And one particular framework that we've discussed across our multiple engagements here at the SOSI Center is the Community Cultural Wealth Framework. And so as a very brief overview, community cultural wealth is devised into 6 forms of capital. And these forms of capital specifically discuss what people from marginalized backgrounds possess and maintain as they're entering into and navigating different structures. It talks about aspirational capital, or what the power of hopes and dreams offer in terms of supporting people as they navigate and engage this space. Linguistic capital, the different world languages that people speak, in addition to other forms of communication that people may draw on to navigate, understand, and interact with our different spaces. Navigational capital, recognizing that for students to actually get to our STEM broadening participation programs, they already were navigating life and have developed a set of skills and characteristics that they now leverage as they are entering into our broadening participation programs, that were skills and characteristics that they developed as a result of them navigating life. Seeing those skills and characteristics as a strength that they bring, or a source of capital. Resistance capital talks about the power that comes with naming and identifying for yourself who you are, how you understand your identities, your experiences, in ways that refute deficit-oriented, stereotypical, racist, sexist, or other forms of oppressive ways that society attempts to name the people and lived experiences of people associated with marginalized groups. That resistance to those dominant stereotypes and those hegemonic ideals serves as a source of capital. And then familial capital, what resources, assets, information, and insight they draw from their families, both blood families and fictive families, where we can then lastly name social capital, recognizing the strengths that come from their different networks, communities, and other spaces. And as this critical strengths-based approach, community cultural wealth offers an explicit critique of the deficit mindset when it comes to thinking about capital for communities of color, and is very intentional to name what people bring as sources of wealth that then can be used to empower and nurture those people by refuting those structural forms of oppression. And so as we think about community cultural wealth in the data collection and analysis process, as we're engaging research that looks at identity, we can ask questions about the different forms of capital that people bring and leverage within our broadening participation programs, and how it informs their STEM identity development or expression. Rather than just looking at traditional measures of identity, such as, do I see myself as a scientist, we can ask questions about how things like aspirations or linguistics or familial structures inform the ways that people navigate their STEM spaces. And we can ask questions about how our activities associated with broadening participation enhances those aspirations, those linguistic capital, that familial, social, or resistance capital, as they're looking to develop and engage a STEM identity or even express a STEM identity. We can think about it in terms of efficacy, very similar. How is this capital potentially mediating efficacy development or expression? Or how is this capital helping us describe what is actually happening when we talk about self-efficacy, this idea in believing in one's capabilities? And ding, 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 very similarly, we can see it with belonging. How is the capital that people possess bringing into their programs, leveraging within our programs, accessing and enhancing within our programmings, informing their relationships to belong in STEM, where we can use it to describe in a very qualitative way, or potentially quantitatively if we're thinking about descriptive statistics. We can use it to think about mediation, looking at relationships between student experience, identity, efficacy, and belonging, where this capital now mediates those stories. Or we can look at it to help us get a deeper probe to explore and explain why it is that we might be seeing identity development, expression, efficacy development, expression, or sense of belonging within our STEM spaces. What is that cultural capital that's situating these variables? Recognizing, again, we're building from what people possess, and we are critiquing those external structures and even looking at our interventions as enhancement and empowerment for these people. Because ultimately, the goal is not to pathologize people or even position our broadening participation programs as quote unquote saviors to these people. Rather, our goals should be looking to understand the influence and impact of programming on the way that people navigate, on the way that people build on lessons, on the way that people understand themselves within STEM spaces and beyond, given those forms and funds of knowledge that they already possess as functional, capable, intelligent beings. And so some major takeaways, as I already kind of introduced this at the beginning of my section, but we'll repeat it, right? We wanted us to talk intentionally about the evaluation process, specifically to thinking about data collection and dissemination. Though I do want to take a point of privilege to say that evaluation is but one way to disseminate outcomes. There's also research that can be done to disseminate outcomes. And if you stick with us here at the SOSI Center, you can learn more about that research component in terms of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating data. It's important to recognize that data can come from multiple sources and places. Data does not just have to be surveys, but it can also be stories. It can be short answers. It can be artifacts that are collected through our programming. It can be our own memoing and observations that we've conducted as broadening participation personnel engaging in this space. Our positionality matters when it comes to both what data we collect, how we collect that data, how we analyze that data, and then how we disseminate that data, which is why it is very important that we think intentionally through strengths-based approaches, critiquing systems of oppression, building from strengths of people. As individuals in the broadening participation space, I operate from the assumption that you intend to do good by your students and those who are participating in our programs. You are here because you want to see them be successful and you want to see them be able to achieve their dreams as they aspire to enter into STEM to do phenomenal things. And because I believe that about us in this space, I believe that it is our intent to see the brilliance and the creativity and the intelligence of the students that are entering into our programs, recognizing that our programs are here to build from their beauty and their brilliance and their creativity and their intelligence, rather than here to quote unquote fix them. Which means that as we think about telling our stories, let's think about the stories our programs and the outcomes from our programs should be telling specific to those end users, our participants. What stories do we want them to be proud of as we're talking about the strengths that they build? What stories of impact do we want to disseminate regarding our programs as we think about the different populations of people that we serve? Again, there is power in storytelling and who we are positionality-wise in telling that story through the data that we collect, the way that we analyze it, and then the way that we present it matters. Thank you so much for participating in our webinar. I hope, and on behalf of our team, we hope that you have engaged in all of the different SOSI Center-focused endeavors. If you have not, here is your opportunity to do so. Be sure to check us out at the website link provided and listed below. For more information about the SOSI Center, as well, be sure to contact our director, Dr. Garcia, should you have specific requests or desires of us as you are looking to engage in this data collection, analysis, and dissemination process through critical strengths-based approaches. Thank you all so much and have a good rest of your day.